So last week I talked about Bruce, now Caitlyn, and how they had the right to choose, and this week I wanted to touch more on the right to knowledge alongside that. So before we go into all of this, first of all, in the Catechism in paragraph 1735, it talks about how there's responsibility for an action. It can be diminished or nullified by ignorance, inadvertence, duress, fear, habit, inordinate attachments, and other psychological or social factors. So I basically just wanted to touch base there first to edify what I spoke about last week about the idea that if a decision is made that was not fully informed, then a full account of responsibility will not therefore be upheld on Judgment Day by God. So, in talking about the soul and everything else I want to touch on moving forward here, we have to have this understanding that there is a God and that as humans we suffer from original sin. We have passions and desires that do not always fully line up with what God calls for our lives. So when we start to talk about anything like this, our soul ends up being involved, because our soul and our body are intertwined to an extent, because on the last day God is it says that He will raise up our bodies. So anything that's a scandal, according to the Catechism in paragraph 2286, talks about conditions that, intentionally or not, make Christian conduct and obedience to the commandments difficult and practically impossible. So honestly, in this situation, I mean, I have to say that Caitlyn, as I have to go with him at this point, but this is a little bit more of a scandal than anything else, and I hate to speak of it that way, but in understanding what knowledge is, because Christians are called to speak the truth in love, right? And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to understand where people are coming from and how we can relate and how we can help each other through this journey of life, because we all have our own crosses to bear. I mean, whether it is some kind of transgender feeling and being a member of that community, whether it's, cancer, or whether it's an addiction, or whatever it is, everybody has their own cross to bear. And ultimately, in paragraph 2339, the Catechism says, apprenticeship in self-mastery. Either a man governs his passions and finds peace, or lets himself be dominated and become unhappy. So when I was thinking about this, watching different movies and everything else where the husband ends up committing adultery and ends up alone in the end. So he's not governing his passions. I watched The Good Guy last night, actually, and it was interesting just to watch, because it was about this guy who works on Wall Street, and he basically just goes on a whim with whichever girl he wants and doesn't govern that passion, and then in the end he winds up alone. Sorry, spoiler alert. And so there's this thing that ends up coming in where if he were to govern his passions, then peace is found. But if he allows them to overrule his life, then he becomes unhappy. So ultimately, all of this stuff that's been going on with Jenner, it's ultimately an experiment in this whole generational gap of allowing people of the same sex to adopt or anything like that is ultimately an experiment, because we don't know what that ends up looking like in the long run, and what that will look like for long-term people who do have two parents of the same gender, or who have a transgender parent, which I've read a couple articles that actually kind of discourage it. And but so as far as the soul goes, the Catechism in paragraph 363 says that the soul signifies the spiritual principle in man, and is basically immortal and eternal, and for this reason man cannot despise his bodily life, obliged to regard his body as good and hold it in honor, since God will raise it up on the last day. So we have this affliction of spirit that ends up going on, and it comes down to integrity. So when we look at how we feel on the inside, or how we are actually born, we have these trials and we have these crosses that we're called to bear. And we need to, they can't be born without Christ. They can't be born without God, without seeking out God. So if this understanding of God is never found, and this understanding of, hey, there is a different way to do this and a different way to handle what I'm going through. When I went through everything with my brain tumor, I had a choice to either, you know, be joyful in it or to be morose. And honestly, for a while I was doing really great, and then I kind of fell away and I wanted to start doing it on my own strength, and it doesn't work. And I can attest to this fact that either, man, I can govern my passions and find peace, or I let myself be dominated and become unhappy. And I mean, I can choose to not go to church, and I can choose to not get up and pray, and I can choose to do all these things, but it's not leading me to a place of contentment and happiness like I know is attainable while seeking God through it, because I've been there. And I've gotten to a place where I've said no to certain things, like getting extra sleep. That's one of my passions, let's call it that. But so I can forego that, or I can choose to be lazy and slothful and not pursue that, and I see what that comes out as. And sin is sin is sin. Anything that comes between us and God is classified as sin. And so in these choices and everything else, I mean, we have a right to choose and we have our free will, but we also have a right to knowledge. And we don't want to go around being ignorant. And sometimes, you know, they say ignorance is bliss, and one day that might be the case, but you can be miserable and ignorant. You can be ignorant and miserable, or you can be knowledgeable and actually reach a fulfilled place where we seek God and actually find what He wants us to, or we can just continue in kind of oblivion and just walk a path that's subjective to however we feel that day. So, which perspectives and perceptions are definitely subjective and not reality. Unfortunately, I can think a guy likes me and he doesn't necessarily like me, and that's the reality, and just because I perceive it to be true doesn't make it true. So that's all I have for today. So I hope that this kind of helps clarify everything that I attempted to come across with last week, and I will look forward to seeing you guys again next week. Happy Sunday. We'll talk to you soon.